In this video, we're going to write our first Spring Boot application. The thing to bear in mind, of course, is that because it's our very first Spring Boot application, we are not going to do anything terribly adventurous. We're certainly not going to use many of the features of a full application that's written in Spring Boot. We're just going to start off with the very basics to see how to start off an application and to get a feel for how RESTful APIs work. So here's our problem that we're going to address. And perhaps I should say at this point, as we go through this video, if you want to pause from time to time to do the same thing on your own computer, then that would probably be a very useful thing for you to do. So we're going to use Spring Boot to write a RESTful API that greets the world and also a named person. Now, to start off, it's easier to go to start.spring.io and use the Spring Initializer to set up the project. So when you go to that web page, you see this view and pick your language that you want to use. Ours is going to be Java. The version of Spring Boot. Enter in your project metadata, which is something that perhaps you want to do that's specific to you, or you can just copy what I've put here. Work out what kind of packaging you want and which version of Java you want. When you've done that, you can then add the dependencies that you need. So click on this button here, and from the very long list of all kinds of dependencies that you can put in, just pick Spring Web. And this will provide a link to all the classes that you will need for a project that involves building web, including RESTful applications, using Spring MVC, and it uses the Apache Tomcat as the default embedded container. A dependency is essentially a link to a whole load of classes that have been written by somebody else that our project needs to be able to operate properly. Now, when you've selected that dependency, you can then go to the bottom of the page and click the Generate button. And the Initializer will then very helpfully build a project that you can then download to your computer. And because we called the artifact greeting, you're going to get a file called greeting.zip in your downloads folder. So then pick it up from downloads, move it to wherever you want to put it, and then unzip the file. And then you'll be able to open IntelliJ. Now, I'm going to show you previously written code, but let's just pop into IntelliJ and click on Open. You then go to your location, wherever it is that you put that, and click on Greeting and OK. IntelliJ will then open the project and display here in the project pane all of those files that were generated for us by Spring Initializer. And we're going to be interested in SRC, meaning source, for source code, main, Java, and then the package name here. At the moment, before you've done anything, what you will get is this class here, which you will be able to view in the editor pane. So having opened the project in IntelliJ, that's what you will get. And you can see that here. But that's only the beginning. We haven't really got a project that is useful, or at least it's not specific to our requirements. And so we will now need to write the REST controller, because a RESTful API needs a REST controller. And that's because Spring Boot, and if you remember, Spring Boot is a framework and it's opinionated, so it has made quite a few decisions for us. And one of those decisions is that it will use the Model View Controller MVC architecture. Eventually, we will get all kinds of components that we will put into this architecture. But for now, we're just going to start with a controller that will receive client requests and respond with a greeting. So what you will need to do is to right-click on this package name, select New Java Class, and then in the next dialog box, enter the name of the class, whatever you want. I'm calling it Greeting API. Other people will call it Greeting REST Controller or whatever. So pick something that is meaningful to you, and then you can hit the Enter key. And that will bring up in the editor the Greeting API class that will be pretty empty. So what you need to do now is to type what you can see here on screen. Here's a few things to watch out for. You don't need to type the import. That will be put in automatically for you when you start typing this. Now, this begins with the @ symbol, so that makes it an annotation. And when you type or start to type REST controller, so @res, maybe with a T as well, it doesn't really matter, IntelliJ will pop up a help menu, and you can select REST controller from that menu, and then it will automatically insert this import statement. The next annotation is a request mapping that allows you to define the path for this API. Because we have defined the path as /greetings, it means that in the web browser, we will need to put in an HTTP request for localhost :8080/greetings. So /greetings is what's defined here. And that is the URL for this API. The next thing you'll need to do is to put in this annotation, @getMapping. And because we're not specifying any other path, that becomes the definition of the default endpoint. The term endpoint is essentially a place where users of the API can go to access some functionality. Now in this case, if all the user does is type that, then they are going to get this particular endpoint. The method name is not really important in terms of the API, but it's really important to us, the developer. So we need to make it a meaningful method name, and we can see that it returns a string. Now that string is simply hello world. When a request is made, such as this request, this method will be executed and it will return hello world. That is the response that will be sent back to the client that has made this original request. So that's our Greeting API class. So we're now ready to run the application. So here is a screenshot of IntelliJ. If you click on this green triangle here, the play button, it will run this application, and that means that the built-in Tomcat server will start. This application will be deployed onto the server, so it is then ready to receive requests from clients. And one way of sending a request to this API is to open up a web browser and to type into the address bar localhost :8080/greetings. And then when you hit enter, that will submit the request to your API. It will hit that default endpoint. The method will return a string that says hello world, and your web browser, which is the client, will then display the response. Now let's add another endpoint to the Greeting API class. So you don't want to have more than one method with exactly the same path, because then the API doesn't know which one to execute when a request comes in. So every method is going to need, or rather every endpoint is going to need, a unique path. So we've already said that this one is our default endpoint. So now when we want to have another method, this is greetPerson, we need to provide a getMapping annotation that has a path that will distinguish this endpoint from that one. And so we can see that this path is /person_name. The person name is in these braces, so that means that it's a variable. So to access this endpoint, we put in the path for the API, and then we append / and then a value, in this case /Graham. So the value Graham will become the value of this variable, person name. And we can access that variable value by using in the parameter list for the method @path variable, and then in brackets the name of that variable. So the name of the variable defined in the path is person name. So by putting @path variable person name, we are linking this parameter with that variable in the path. And so when the request comes in from the client, whatever value, in this example, Graham, whatever value is put into here will become the value of that parameter. So now name has got the value Graham, and therefore we can make use of that value in the parameter in our processing within the method. Now in this case, our method is going to greet a person and it's going to return a string. So what we'll do then is return hello, space, and then the value held by the parameter, which in this example is Graham. So it'll say hello, space, Graham. And then we can run the application again by a click on that symbol. The built-in Tomcat server is already running, so all that will happen is that the latest version, the newly compiled version of this API, will then be deployed to the Tomcat server. And so now we can send in another request in our client, which is the web browser. And you'll see that we've typed in not just the default, but we've also added / and then a value, which means that it will target this endpoint here and therefore execute the greetPerson method, which is why we get back the message hello, Graham. Now, when you run this again, why not try putting in your name instead of my name, and you'll see that the message will be different. And that's one of the great things about these APIs. It means that we can put in data and get back some dynamically generated response. And that's a really important part of REST APIs. And you'll see that I've put in another request, this time with 2 words, and then this will be updated accordingly. You can test your applications by using IntelliJ's built-in HTTP client. And it's really easy to access that, because as you're viewing the greeting API class in IntelliJ, next to each of these endpoints, you get a little symbol, a sort of a green circle with a grey world on it. So you click on that, and it will generate for you a file called generated-request.http. And that'll be down in the scratches. So you might need to open scratches and consoles and then expand scratches, and then you'll find that file down in there. In that file, we can put in some requests. Now, by clicking here, the request will be generated for you, and all you've got to do is to pick which of these options you want to use. Now, we're going to go with just http://localhost:8080. So we click on that. That will generate this request here, and then you'll be able to click the play or the run symbol right next to that request, and it will automatically submit the request to the API and display here the response information, including all the header information, which is what you get in the web browser. But of course the web browser doesn't actually display that unless you pick an option in the menu to see it. In our HTTP client down in IntelliJ, we will get to see all of that. And there's the response as well as a response code that 200 tells us that everything worked perfectly. It was fantastic. We can then generate a whole load of such requests, and that makes testing our application much easier, because we can have all of those requests written in here, and then when we make a change to the application, we can just click, 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 and check the responses that come back. Now, this isn't the best way of testing. We will see later in the module other ways in which we can automate the testing. But for now, this is a useful way of proceeding and making sure that we are consistent with our tests. Now, we'll also, for the purposes of just illustration, illustrate how to do a post request. You'll remember from the previous video, the introduction to REST, that post is supposed to be used to effect a change within the target resource. Now, that isn't happening here, but we'll use this as an opportunity to see how a post request can be submitted. So first of all, in the Greeting API class, we need another endpoint, but this time we need an annotation that says that this is a post mapping. And with that post mapping, we're going to say that our parameter is going to be the request body. So we put in an annotation at request body. And therefore, when we generate the post request, we need some data that will be the request body. In the request in HTTP client, we follow the URI with a blank line, and that is necessary because it divides the request from the payload, that is the request body. And our payload is going to be Mr. G.Mansfield. That becomes the value of name, so that when we return a string, it's going to return hello, comma, space, followed by whatever this payload was. And when that request is run, that's exactly what we see as the response. So we've introduced a couple of terms here that you might want to read about: MVC architecture and API endpoint. Just do a little bit of background reading about those. But when you've done everything that I've shown you in this video, you will have written your first Spring Boot application. Congratulations.